What are some of the common misconceptions that people have about how best to control anger?
Maybe you've heard the old joke, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Well, how do you become an angry, aggressive person? The answer is the same. Practice, practice, practice.
Those that are addicted to social media or just addiction in general tend to have higher levels of narcissism.
People who are high in narcissism are more aggressive physically, verbally. They're more likely to displace their aggression onto innocent targets.
Welcome to the show. Thank you for taking part in this immersive listening experience. A meaningful existence is a moving target that, no matter how close, will always be out of reach. We hope this message finds you with an outstretched hand. As we attempt to uncover complex truths, remember, life's toughest questions can be answered if we all just focus on one thing: being good people.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to Good People, episode 60. My guest today is Dr. Brad Bushman. He is a professor of communication at Ohio State University. He has served as a member of President Obama's Committee on Gun Violence, and he has testified before U.S. Congress on the topic of youth violence. In today's episode, expect to learn about the differences between anger and aggression, why anger is such a pertinent emotion in human beings, the common myths and misconceptions about how to actually control anger, why we get hangry, and much more. Before we begin, if you guys are on YouTube, please like, comment, and subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. Enjoy the show. Tell me, when did you become first interested in studying anger and aggression?
I think it was when I was an undergraduate student. I took an honors course in human aggression, and along with other honors courses I was taking, like Western civilization, Greek mythology, and I was just fascinated by the research. And I was actually studying to be an engineer at the time, and that course made me change my major to psychology and become an aggression researcher.
What was it about psychology that you feel like drew you in more so than engineering?
Well, I wanted to do research on human aggression after taking that honors course in human aggression, and I loved engineering. It's not anything against engineering. Engineers are great or whatever, but for me, I wanted to do that research, and I asked the professor who does this research. That we were reading just stacks of journal articles on scientific studies on human aggression. And he said, social psychologists do. Well, I'd never even heard of a social psychologist. Of course, I'd heard of a psychologist, but I didn't know what a social psychologist was. And so I said, how do I become a social psychologist? He said, well, you need a PhD. So I said, well, okay, I'm going to get one. And he says, you'll have to teach and do research. So I got a master's degree in education to help me be a better teacher, and a master's degree in statistics to help me be a better researcher, and a PhD in social psychology so I could study aggression.
Very good. I feel like anger is one of those things that obviously anybody that would be listening obviously probably knows what it is at probably a very elementary level. I think everybody has some sort of relationship with anger. But something that I'm fascinated by specifically is how are you defining anger? What is anger specifically?
Well, anger is an emotional response to some threat or provocation. It could be a real one or even an imagined one. Most emotions are placed along two dimensions. One is whether it's positive versus negative, and one is whether it's high versus low arousal. So anger would be a negative emotion, high in arousal.
Is that always the case? Is there any, like, obviously I would imagine, there's probably a degree, but even anger in its most subtle forms is still high arousal, still negative?
Well, yeah, but it's a continuum. So anger can vary from like mild irritation to extreme rage. But even if you're mildly irritated, your arousal levels are still elevated, like your heart rate or blood pressure.
Mm. What exactly is happening psychologically when we are angry? Outside of that, would that kind of be it, or would there be more to it?
Yeah, so uh, like any emotion, anger is characterized by arousal levels and the interpretation we give of that arousal. So when people become angry, their heart rate and blood pressure, for example, increase, and then they label that arousal. And if they anger is one of the labels that they could give for that arousal. And some anger treatments focus on having you label it something else, so that you don't become angry, like cognitive behavior therapy does that.
Mm. Why do you feel like anger is such a pertinent, human emotion? I feel like it's like a hot topic. Forgive me for the pun, but it's something that I think a lot of people probably at some level struggle with. And why do you think that is?
Yeah, it's the emotion that people have the most difficulty controlling. People report they're uh, not very effective at doing it, and I think it's because the things that make us angry we have little control over, like the threats and provocations. For example, if we're driving down the road, we really don't have much control over other drivers that may pull out in front of us and then slow down or whatever to increase our angry feelings. So I think it's a sense of frustration and lack of control.
Has there ever been like a specific purpose for anger as an emotion? I listen to a lot of podcasts, especially, I like listening to researchers being interviewed. And I feel like there's a very specific approach lens that a lot of people view everything that is related to evolutionary psychology, which is that there is some like primitive aspect to a lot of the things that we feel. And I guess I just don't quite know ever how to place that. Like obviously we live in a very technologically advanced modern world, and at some level I don't really know how much we can pull away from the quote unquote like primitive behaviors that we've always had. And basically the research and the information that I consume is that the same systems are in place within us as human beings. It just presents itself a little bit differently. And so I'm curious if, maybe in the past there was some productive use of anger. I know we've kind of labeled it as this negative emotion, but are there any unseen positives or what's the purpose behind having it?
Yeah, for sure. All emotions are adaptive from an evolutionary perspective. And I just need to qualify this by saying I'm not an evolutionary psychologist. But when people become angry, they feel powerful and strong. So, although anger is a negative emotion, it's not necessarily a bad emotion. And it motivates people to try to solve problems or injustices. So you could think about any social movement from Black Lives Matter to Me Too, uh, women's rights to vote, whatever. They're all fueled by anger. Women are angry that they can't vote, or Black people are angry that police officers are killing them, or women are angry that they're being sexually assaulted, and that anger fuels them to take action, and that can have many forms, like protests or writing to your elected officials. But anger motivates us to try to approach and solve problems. So it is adaptive in that way, and it might be adaptive in another way as well. When you become angry, it's like a cue for other people to back off. before it escalates into physical aggression. So it could actually lead to less physical aggression if you notice that the person you're talking to is angry. You may be less likely to confront them. So it may be adaptive in that way as well.
Yeah. The interesting thing I've heard it put this way: hope is, hope is the result basically of anger or frustration with some system and courage to do something about it. So I think that's a nice twist on this, where like from a productive standpoint, probably the most important and greatest social changes have come about from anger and frustration or whatever.
Yeah, I'm not really an expert on hope, but I do know that anger fuels many protests, and including many that I've participated in myself. So
something that you do a bit of that I've seen you put out recently is this idea of learning how to control anger. What are some of the common misconceptions that people have about how best to control anger?
Well, I think the largest misconception is that it's healthy to vent your anger. Uh, it has other words like blow off steam, get it off your chest. Um, but that's a very ineffective way to reduce anger. So, probably the biggest misconception is that it's healthy to vent your anger, blow off steam, get it off your chest. Maybe you've heard the old joke, how do you get to Carnegie Hall? Practice, practice, practice. Well, how do you become an angry, aggressive person? The answer is the same: practice, practice, practice. And when people vent their anger, that's exactly what they're doing. They're practicing how to behave more aggressively. They hit, they kick, they swear, they shout, they slam doors, whatever. All those are aggressive actions, and we know that practice makes perfect. Um, Also, I mentioned previously that anger is characterized by high levels of arousal. So if you're angry, the goal is to reduce that arousal level. But if you're screaming and shouting and swearing and kicking and slamming doors, screaming in pillows, pounding on punching bags, what have you, you just keep the arousal levels high. Another problem with venting anger is when people do it, they often ruminate about whatever it is that made them angry in the first place. And they mull it over in their mind. And research shows that rumination's a terrible way to get rid of anger, right? It's a lot better to distract yourself or think about something else than whatever made you angry in the first place. So venting anger is a lot like using gasoline to put out a fire. It just feeds the flame. It keeps arousal levels high. It keeps aggressive and angry thoughts alive in memory. So it's not an effective way to reduce anger, but that myth is hard to dispel because angry people love to scream, swear, shout, slam doors, kick trash cans, whatever. And if in our studies we ask them, for example, after they wallop a punching bag, how they feel, and like over 75% of them say they feel great. So if you talk to somebody who's gone to a rage room where they put on protective gear, they get a baseball bat and just start breaking stuff. If you ask them after they come out of that room how they feel, they'll probably say, I feel great. I feel better. That was therapeutic. That was healthy. But our research shows that good feeling just reinforces aggressive behavior. So people do feel better after venting anger. People love to vent their anger, but that doesn't mean it's healthy. People feel good after taking street drugs, or eating chocolate or whatever. So the fact that you feel better after you do something doesn't mean it's a healthy thing to do.
Right. The anger at some level still persists. Is there You mentioned it's a bit adaptive in that, you basically are practicing being angry if you vent. Do you know if there is some sort of relationship where the longer you go about having this uncontrolled behavior, doing rage rooms, venting anger, is it harder to break those spells over time?
Yeah, for sure. Not just for anger, for any behavior, right? The longer you smoke, the harder it is to quit smoking, for example. So,
What are some of the alternatives? What are some of the best ways that we can actually control anger?
well, a common analogy that's used when people talk about anger is like a pressure cooker on a stove. So, anger is like the pressure that builds up inside, and you have to like uh, vent it or blow off steam. And if you don't, presumably it will explode. The pressure cooker will explode. Similarly, you'll explode if you don't vent your anger or blow off steam. So this analogy, though, assumes there's only two responses to anger. Try to stuff it inside. That's not healthy. Research shows that can lead to cardiovascular disease, for example, or express it. That's not healthy. That also leads to cardiovascular disease. And as I mentioned earlier, it also leads to higher levels of anger and aggression. So a better approach is to turn down the stove, turn down the heat. Um, People don't even think about that, but that's the most effective approach. And my former PhD student and I just finished a meta-analysis on this topic, uh, and we focused specifically on any studies that manipulated activities that increase versus decrease arousal. So another common myth is when you're angry, you should go for a run. Well, you should definitely go for a run if you want to improve your cardiovascular health. Running is good for your heart, but it's not good for managing anger because it keeps the arousal levels high. And it also can be monotonous and boring, just especially if it's like on a treadmill or something or doing stairmasters. Those are also ineffective. Instead, what's effective and what we found in our meta-analysis, it was a meta-analysis of over 150 studies with over 10,000 participants. So this is a very large body of evidence. And we found that anything that decreases arousal is effective at decreasing anger and aggression. That could be like taking deep breaths, breathing. Maybe you've heard of the 4-7-8 breathing technique. You breathe in for 4 seconds, hold it for 7 seconds, and then breathe out for 8 seconds. So breathing, that's just one example. Muscle relaxation, where you tighten and loosen different parts of your body. You start with your feet and work all the way up to the top of your head. That works. Yoga is effective. I'm not talking about the hot yoga where you're like frantically doing things, but the calmer one. Meditation, mindfulness, all these techniques are very effective in reducing anger and aggression. And, they're either really cheap or free. You don't have to pay anybody to take deep breaths or to, you know, do mindfulness or whatever. You can go to yoga studio if you want, but so these are these are very effective procedures for reducing anger. If you have a chronic anger problem, you're always angry all the time, you need professional help. And research has shown that cognitive behavior therapy is very effective at that. But just for these daily hassles, and even just for all around health, anything that decreases your arousal works. And we were surprised and delighted by this findings because we knew that things like yoga and mindfulness and meditation reduce stress, but they also reduce anger and aggression. So we thought that was a pretty novel, important finding.
Mm. That's very interesting to me about the running stuff in particular, because I feel like that's a pretty common, like, oh, I'll just go for a run. That's like a normal way people decompress. It seems like the intensity of like physical exertion's okay, but the intensity of it is what matters. So I would surmise that maybe running maybe allows that anger to fester, especially if you're running hard, high heart rate, et cetera. But if you go for a walk, or, you know, maybe even you do combine some of these elements, go for a walk, do your breathing patterns. But anything that's going to keep that arousal low or lower it seems like that's the ticket.
Yep. It's like a continuum.
And I would imagine too that there's probably a lot of individualization to this, right? Like obviously people will have their preferences. Yoga might not be as effective as breathing, or it might not be as effective as walking for others, right?
We actually found that these results were very robust. Any activity that decreases arousal was effective for people of all genders, people of all ages, people of all races, people from Eastern countries and Western countries. We found that these procedures were effective in group sessions or individual therapy sessions. We found they were effective in laboratory settings, in field settings, even online. So these effects were very robust. You really can't go wrong doing them.
Would you suggest that that's a worthwhile pursuit for people, is to find some sort of decompressing activity that they can
for sure
partake in?
Yeah.
You brought up an interesting point there. So the regulatory stuff is fascinating because there's no differences among whatever group you test. On the flip side of that, does anger manifest itself differently based off of some of those different characteristics?
Yeah. So anger is different than aggression. So anger is an emotional response, and aggression is any behavior intended to harm another person who doesn't want to be harmed. So how that anger is manifest may differ across individuals. For example, research has shown that men are more likely to use physical aggression than women are, whereas women are more likely to use indirect forms of aggression, like spreading gossip or rumors or trying to damage social relationships, than men are. That occurs not just for men and women, but also for boys and girls from a pretty early age. You can see it from about age 8 on up. But really young kids, like toddlers, it doesn't really matter whether they're boys or girls. They bite, they hit, they kick, they pull hair, they trip other kids. So, but as they grow older, you can see these differences, and they probably reach their most extreme in adulthood, where if you look at violent criminal behavior, almost all violent crimes are committed by young men.
I'm excited to dig a little bit more into aggression here in a second, but I want to touch back on, I guess, temperament would be a good word to use for the control of the anger. Is temperament, you mentioned anger is something that if you engage with it often, you're basically training yourself to be angry. You're practicing it. I would imagine this temperament is something that is trained and adaptable as well.
Yeah, there's a difference between trait anger and state anger. So trait anger is relatively stable individual difference over time and across situations. Some people just become more angry regardless of the setting they're in than other people do. That's a personality trait. Whereas state anger is more temporary. It's caused by environmental event, like somebody cutting you off in traffic. So there are definitely individual differences in that, just like there are trait and state anxiety. Some people are just more anxious than others, and almost everybody becomes anxious when they take a test. So that's state anxiety. So there are individual differences. When it comes to aggressive behavior, there's what's called a dark tetrad of personality. So narcissism, Machiavellianism, psychopathy, and sadism. These are the four dark personality traits that are related to aggression. So those are some other important individual differences. And also on the flip side, things like self-control, there are individual differences in self-control as well. And people high in self-control are better able to control their angry feelings and aggressive impulses.
Are there any traits or types of people that you can identify that are more, that gravitate more towards this trait, anger versus state anger? Or is it kind of just, there's no rhyme or reason? It's just people's individual personality trait. Is it hard to pinpoint exactly, what types of groups maybe face this more than others?
Well, each trait is a little bit different, but sort of a good rule of thumb is all personality traits have a genetic component. You're born that way, but also an environmental component. Some things can bring out those tendencies. So it depends on the genes you have at birth, your genetic composition, and also the type of environment you're raised in.
I know you just mentioned aggression and anger. The difference is anger is the emotion, the arousal. Aggression is how it's manifesting, more so like the action, I guess, that's behind the anger. What are some other ways that you see aggression manifest that we're seeing in our world today?
There used to be just this idea of bullying, which is you're afraid to go to school because some big guy would, shove your head in a toilet or pick on you or on the playground or whatever. But, since the digital age, cyberbullying has become much more common. And you don't need to be big or strong to do it either. Like anybody can bully others online. So cyberbullying is something that's common. Online people, especially research shows when people are anonymous, their inhibitions are lower. So if you're using an alias rather than your real name, if people can't see your face, if people have no idea who you are, then deviant behavior is more likely, including aggressive behavior.
I just spoke with Dr. Drew Single on the show, and he is out of UC Davis. Are you familiar?
I don't know Dr. Single personally, but I'm familiar with his work.
Awesome. Yeah. And he was talking to me, something that I found super fascinating in regards to this. So obviously his research centers around social media use, media, and its effect on adolescent development, is that they did a study. I can't remember exactly the numbers, but it was they were comparing an American group of adolescents to a South Korean group of adolescents, and the degree to which each group of people experienced, the amount that each group experienced these, negative mental emotions associated with social media use, higher anxiety, even cases of narcissism and things like that was the same. But the degree to which the South Korean kids experienced it was significantly lower than that of the American kids. And he predicted that the reason why was just the cultural difference of how they view family or how they view community. And they obviously have a little bit more of a collectivism approach when it comes to their social structure. And he even interviewing the South Korean kids, it was like, why did you decide not to post this? And there was a big emphasis that they had on like, I gave some forethought to how my friends would perceive this post before I actually posted it. And that was less common in the in the American thing. So it's very interesting that I think there's a bit of a carryover here. And it's disheartening at some level, but I feel like it's hopeful because there is an opportunity to change it at a social level if we just become aware of it, and I think value it and teach young people about it.
Right. So I mentioned the dark tetrad of personality. One of those dark traits is narcissism, and past research has shown that narcissism is higher in individualistic countries, people who live in individualistic countries, than people who live in collectivistic countries. So that might be another example of those differences.
Yeah, it seems interesting too. I've spoken with another individual, Professor Phil Reed. He is at Swansea University in Wales, and we talked about social media addiction. And there's a cyclical nature to that too. Those that are addicted to social media, or just addiction in general, tend to have higher levels of narcissism. And then it sort of is this self-fulfilling prophecy where you're existing in this loop of going back and forth and believing of your own importance. And it seems like all of this is starting to connect in my head, which is very fascinating, that we're facing this problem from multiple angles here. And I guess it doesn't really matter what the source is, but nailing down the importance of connecting with those around you and helping out your neighbor and doing things for the good of others is a very worthwhile thing to encourage other people to do.
We also did a recent meta-analysis on narcissism and aggression. It involved 437 studies with over 120,000 participants. And across the board, people who are high in narcissism are more aggressive physically, verbally. They're more likely to bully others. They're more likely to displace their aggression onto innocent targets than those who are low in narcissism.
Are you aware of how we can, I guess maybe as like it's a family parental value thing that we need to do a better job of, I suppose, with raising kids. Are you aware of like productive ways to do that? Like I just, obviously education for me sounds like the answer, because it's like, if we just tell people that, what it is that we're looking at, what the negative outcomes are going to be if we don't address them, et cetera, people would make changes. But that just seems too, I feel like one of the hardest challenges about living in a society like ours that values sovereignty so much is there's such a high burden associated with actually doing the right thing, because it's totally left up to the individual and the family to do so. And so I'm always left with, I don't know what the solution to this stuff is. Do you have any idea of where we should go with that?
Well, we've done research on the development of narcissism, and parenting practices matter a lot. So first, there's a difference between self-esteem, which means I'm okay, I'm as good as other people, and narcissism, which means I'm better than other people. And from every parent wants their child to have healthy self-esteem, to believe they're okay. And the best way, our research shows the best way for that to happen, we've done longitudinal studies so we can predict it in the future. And the best thing for parents to do to generate this healthy self-esteem is just to tell their children they love them and they accept them for who they are. But we also found that parental practices can influence the development of narcissism. And parents, if you want to predict which children are more likely to become narcissists, even after controlling for how narcissistic their parents are, it's parents who tell their children, you're better than other kids. You're the best. You're special, right? So that type of parenting is not healthy because it can lead to the development of narcissism in children. And narcissism is not good for anyone. It's not good for society, for sure, because people who are narcissistic are more aggressive, for example. But it's also not good for the individual, because if you already think you're great and wonderful, then why try to improve? And so much of life is about trying to better ourselves and make improvements.
Right. I never really considered that. Like there's a certain mindset that's associated with trying to improve the self. And I think that tends to lead to more accepting, loving. I can't tell you how many times in my life that I've realized that, I'm just the same as everybody. Like I'll do something is seemingly great, or I'll accomplish this big goal. And then I get there, I'm like, oh, there's a lot of other people that have done this too.
Yeah. If you got a second, let me just read my take-home message from my webpage. After doing research on aggression and violence for over 30 years, I have concluded that the most harmful belief people can have is the belief that they are superior to others. For example, their religion, race or ethnicity, gender or gender identity, sexual orientation, political party or ideology, school, city, state, country, etc. is the best. This feeling of superiority can lead to mistreatment of others, which hurts society as a whole. Every person on this planet is part of the human family. No person is superior to any other person.
I really love that. I think that that's why I named the show Good People. Like, there's no discriminatory aspect to that other than how you act. And if you can just be a good person, which obviously that's very general, it's going to look a little bit different to everybody. But I think we all know what that means. No matter what you put your hands on, whatever work you do, whatever you find yourself doing, you're always going to be treating others with respect. You won't be causing harm. It's like the leave it better than you found it sort of mentality. You'll leave this place and it'll be better than when you arrived.
Be kind to others.
Yeah. Let's talk about violent video games. This is something I'm really fascinated with. I grew up playing violent video games. I was born in 2000, so like I was kind of feel like I was the generation that got the really advanced stuff, but we didn't quite know what it was doing to us yet. I played other kinds of video games too, but what are the outcomes of violent video games? What happens when kids play violent video games?
Yeah, well, hundreds of studies have been conducted on this topic, and the results are very compelling. Violent video games increase aggressive thoughts, increase angry feelings, increase physiological arousals, increase aggression levels. They decrease feelings of compassion and empathy for others, and they decrease helping behavior. And the effects are pretty robust also for people of all genders, ages, from Eastern and Western countries. Of course, playing a violent video game is not the only risk factor for aggression and violence, but it's definitely one risk factor, and it's one we can do something about. And of course, there are protective factors. I don't know you personally, but my guess is there are also some protective factors at play in your life that reduce the risk of aggressive behavior.
What do you mean by that?
Protective factors, things like, having a high IQ, having good parents, having parents who monitor what you're doing, being free from alcohol and drug addiction, not from an impoverished environment, things like that.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. I think, that probably, especially like on the like individual side, my parents obviously did a good job too. Like, hey, just remember this isn't real life. Like, the games that I played a lot of like first person shooter games, and it was like stuff like this is happening in real life, and it is not as happy and fun as the video game that you're playing, sort of thing.
But even fantasy violence can increase aggression for sure. And more realistic violence has larger effects, but fantasy violence can. And younger children's, like until they're about age 7 or 8, they don't know the difference between reality and fantasy.
I see. All my hours on World of Warcraft were not good for me. When it comes to, I hear this a lot, like boys will be boys kind of thing. I do jujitsu. I've been doing jujitsu for like 4 years. And to me, it's always just been like a skill development, preparedness. I really enjoy the martial art aspect of it. It's a self-improvement thing. I will admit that there are days that I go in there and I feel awesome getting to like choke somebody out, and then I leave and I'm like feel all good. That obviously is probably the reinforcement that you were describing earlier. But I feel like I've always had this sort of distance from it, where I'm not doing it as an anger relief thing. It's a fitness thing. It's a again preparedness thing. I feel like too often I hear in that space, especially with young children that are doing jujitsu, like, oh, it's a great way for them to like blow off some steam or get some energy out, etc. Where do you draw the line for that? Because obviously we know that getting exercise and activity for kids is great. But when does it become a problem where, I think of this one kid specifically, obviously I won't name him, but I used to watch him roll when he was very little, and he would just like, he was so angry, and he would like have a vendetta against everybody that he was rolling with. And he was like pushing kids' faces and obviously those things were addressed, but where is that line in your opinion between a healthy behavior, something that allows kids to get exercise, and something that is going to cause problems in terms of aggression?
Yeah, well, I have a 3rd-degree black belt in Tang Soo Do, so I've been practicing martial arts for many, many years, and there are a lot of positive features about martial arts. They can teach self-esteem, discipline, self-control. They help with flexibility, cardiovascular health, self-defense. There are so many good things about martial arts, and like everything else, there are individual differences in responses to it. But I think, and there are probably individual differences in martial arts. I only trained in Tang Soo Do, not Jiu-Jitsu, but in general, those activities, I would say, are not optimal for anger management, because even if they do, that's not to say they're not helpful in other areas of life. And I found them to be extremely helpful in my life. But that is to say that if I want to manage my anger, going to the dojang to practice martial arts should not be my first choice. Taking deep breaths, or trying to relax, doing meditation, mindfulness, yoga, something like that would be more effective.
Something that I'm curious about, and I think everybody listening has been waiting for me to ask this question, is what's the deal with the getting hangry, and why do so many people get angry when they're hungry?
Yeah, so we didn't come up with the term hangry, but our lab did the first research to show that it's real. And we also tried to understand why it occurs. So hangry is a combination of 2 words, hungry plus angry, hangry, which indicates that hungry people are often angry people. When people get hungry, they tend to be irritable and cranky. So that's the basic idea. And we've done research to show that it's real. So the part of your brain just behind your forehead is called the prefrontal cortex. And that's the part of your brain in charge of executive functioning and executive controls. And one of those functions of that part of your brain is to control and manage emotions, including anger. And your brain is about the size of a grapefruit, and it's only about 2% of your body weight, but it consumes like over 20% of the calories. So it's a very, very demanding organ. And it needs fuel to regulate emotions. Your brain needs fuel, and it gets that in the form of glucose, which comes from the food that we eat. And it's especially helpful to eat food that's healthy, because that, like whole grains and veggies, for example, because they keep your glucose levels higher for a longer period of time. So you can eat a candy bar if you want, and it will increase your glucose level, but then it just crashes right after that. So we've done studies where we have people drink lemonade, either sweetened with real sugar, which has glucose, or with Splenda, which is a sugar substitute with no glucose. And in blind taste tests, they can't tell us which ones witch, and then we make them angry, and we give them a chance to behave aggressively by giving somebody loud blasted noise through headphones. And we find that people who drink and we make them fast for 4 hours before they come to our lab. And college students are always eating, so they're pretty hungry when they come in our lab, and we tell them they have to do that because this is part of a taste test study, and we're going to have them taste this lemonade. And we find that people who drink the lemonade sweetened with sugar are significantly less aggressive than people who drink the lemonade with a sugar substitute. People who have diabetic symptoms are also have more problems regulating their anger and aggression. And we did a study with married couples where we measured their glucose, their blood glucose every morning and night. And people who had low levels of blood glucose were more angry with their spouses and also more aggressive. They gave them louder blasts of noise through headphones than those who were not. So it's really important to not discuss sensitive topics on an empty stomach. Make sure you do it over dinner, for example, or after dinner, because hunger is real. And, during the pandemic, it was even worse because a lot of people couldn't get food. And in some countries, it's a problem. And, I'm not saying it's the only cause of violence and aggression, but, it's a very robust finding that hungry people tend to be cranky and irritable. And it's also a very robust finding that cranky and irritable people tend to be more aggressive and violent. So
it seems like that would carry over to other factors that would increase arousal levels. Because is that basically what's happening? I mean, obviously, you mentioned the glucose is necessary to feeding the brain pretty much. But like being hungry or being stressed out about anything in particular basically just kind of shortens the fuse. So it would be easy for us to say that any sort of behavior that is going to increase arousal and it will shorten the fuse will manifest itself to crankier and more irritable people, which will manifest into more aggressive people.
Yeah.
It sounds like talking to you that obviously we've defined this difference between anger and aggression. Anger itself is more of a tool. It's the emotion. It's the thing. It's what we do with it. And aggression is like a poor and negative manifestation of it. Would you say that what we're essentially shooting for, obviously we probably can never negate anger. It's always going to be a present human emotion, but the objective then becomes to mitigate aggression, mitigate aggressive acts. Or are there any upsides to aggressive behavior that you could see?
Aggression works in the short run. So people who are aggressive get what they want immediately. They tend to, but it has many long-term unintended negative consequences. So people who act aggressively may think, oh, that worked. I got what I wanted. But the target hates you now. And especially if it's a significant other, that's a big problem. So, I think it's really important to work on managing anger because, anger pretty much can only hurt you, but it also increases the likelihood of aggression. So if you learn how to control it, you're less likely to behave aggressively. And like I said, aggression is any behavior intended to harm another person, who doesn't want to be harmed. So we don't want to harm other people, and they don't want to be harmed. So anything we can do to, it's not a one-to-one relationship. People can behave aggressively who are not angry, right? Like a hitman may shoot somebody and not even know them and not be angry with them. But there is a strong relationship between anger and aggression.
Something that has just come to my mind is the martial arts argument again. Do we have the ability to raise our threshold at which we become agitated and angry or show signs of aggression? And obviously, I know you mentioned that, like, if we're going to these martial arts or these fighting styles that to mitigate aggression, that's probably not the best place to start. It's better to find these ways to release the pressure cooker valve, like breathing, yoga, meditation, etc. But something that I have found for me, and obviously this is totally anecdotal, is that I guess maybe it's more so to do with the self-confidence that I have now with myself, having participated in these martial arts. Like I'm much easier to, I have way more self-control when it comes to if somebody like runs into me and bumps into me at a bar or whatever, or whoever I'm out with, I'm not going to like grab his shoulder and be like, hey buddy, watch where you're going. It's like, I know what violence and aggression feels like because I do it at jiu-jitsu in a controlled environment. And I know that it's not worth it to incite that type of behavior. And so I guess I've kind of talked my way to the point here, but I think that from a positive perspective, all of those things that you mentioned previously, self-control and confidence, probably play a big part in where that threshold is.
Yeah, anything that increases self-control is good. And actually, my colleague Roy Baumeister has done some research and others showing that there are self-control exercises you can do. Like if you're normally right-handed, do things with your left hand. That can increase those self-control exercises. It takes more effort and control to do something with your left hand if you're right-handed, or if you're left-handed, do it with your right hand, right? Stir coffee or open doors or type or, whatever. So yeah, anything we can do to increase our self-control is healthy, including making sure you're not hangry. Eating healthy foods is really important.
Real quick, I think this is a topic that many people will be interested in. Where can you point people to go if they're interested in learning more about anger, aggression, and some of the other work that you do?
Yeah, I sent you a link. If you just Google the American Psychological Association, APA, and anger, they have some helpful online resources.
Awesome. Yeah, and I'll be sure to include that. I didn't quite see your email, but I'll be sure to include that in the show notes for anybody that's listening that's interested in checking it out. Well, Brad, thank you so much for doing this. I'm grateful that you came on. I got to learn a lot from you. I think that, again, this will be an interesting topic that piques a lot of people's interest to learn more about.
My pleasure.
Thank you guys so much for listening to this week's episode of Good People. If you enjoyed my conversation with Brad and are interested in learning more, make sure you head on down to the show notes below and check out the links that he has provided. If you guys are on YouTube, before you head out, please like, comment, and subscribe, and turn on our notifications so you don't miss our weekly uploads. If while you're listening, you enjoyed, please share this episode with someone you love, perhaps your grandma. We'll see you next time.